And with that, I would like to turn it over to today's speakers, Joan Biebelhausen and Faith Amdahl.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Our topic today is suicide awareness and prevention. And this is a difficult subject because it can be very tragic, but it's also something that we're afraid of. We don't know how to talk about. We don't want to be the one that causes something. We don't know what to do sometimes when we're concerned about somebody. We may have had some of these feelings ourselves. And as you're watching this program today, if you find yourself feeling distressed, please, please, please ask for help. We're here to support you. We're here to provide information and resources, and suicide is a forever decision. And if you find yourself feeling any kind of distress, we hope that you will reach out. LCL has a 24-hour hotline, and information on that will be provided later, as well as it's in the materials. My name is Joan Biebelhausen, and I'm the director at Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. I'm an attorney and am very happy to be able to bring these important topics that are related to impairment in our profession, distress in our profession, joined by Faith Amdahl, who is going to talk a little bit about herself and why she is here. Faith?
Hi, thank you, Joan. Good morning to everybody. Happy January. I started doing this it's been 12 years now. I started speaking with Joan, who asked me to speak many years before that. I lost my brother, Charles Amdahl, to suicide in early January of 2008, which has now been 14 years, and it seems like it's gone by in a flash. My life was turned completely upside down when this happened, and my folks were still with us, and it just set off a whole series of events for the next 14 years. And what I hope to do today is to use my experience as being a survivor and being a witness to what happened before and after my brother's death by suicide, to educate all of you and to look for possible, warning signs in clients and colleagues, and to be able to get a toolkit, I guess, to deal with this issue, which pops up fairly frequently, in our relationships with people in the profession.
Thank you, Faith. And so today's program is a proof for elimination of bias credit, because it is stigma about a potentially disabling condition, mental health, that has no greater impact than when somebody's mental health is at a point where suicide seems like a reasonable option. And so we're going to try and reduce some of that stigma and reduce the bias about people who have mental health issues, who may be suicidal. We're going to talk about how stress can predict mental health issues and suicidal behavior, and talk a little bit about those issues in our profession. And we'll do some discussion on what exactly is suicidal ideation, what are some of the theories that we might learn from, and what can we learn about suicide prevention. And in your materials, what you'll have is a number of references. And so, for example, the QPR Institute, I'll be talking about that method of suicide prevention later. Classes are available for you to take that go much deeper into this protocol, and your organization can bring this in. As an individual, you can take these classes, that sort of thing. So there's much more out there. When we look at our profession, there was one ABA study that said half of the lawyers are satisfied or very satisfied with their work. Well, that means half either did not answer or are not. And so we have that distress in our profession. We also have higher levels of alcohol use and some mental health issues that have been surveyed than the rest of the population. So in a study that was released in 2016, 1 in 5 of us drink at unhealthy levels. Now, that doesn't mean that we're at a point where an assessor would say, you need to be abstinent. for your health or even your survival. No, it just means we're drinking at unhealthy levels. There's a much smaller percentage of those folks who have what would be considered a serious alcohol use disorder, where it would be recommended that they abstain. When this study was done, around 6 to 8% of the population as a whole met criteria for unhealthy drinking. In the last year or so of the pandemic, overall, the population has been surveyed, and a significantly higher percentage of the population as a whole meets that criteria, which would suggest that that number for lawyers might be even higher. The 2016 study showed that just over 1 in 4 of us met criteria for depression and 18% for anxiety. What we believe has happened with the pandemic is that those numbers have gone up, particularly anxiety, because that's what's coming into our program. That's what's coming into programs around the country. And when we look at comparative overall population numbers compared to our profession, the overall population has been surveyed and those numbers have gone up significantly. And then when asked, do you think you may have had symptoms of depression, or do you think you may have had symptoms of anxiety? Then a far higher percentage of our profession said yes. So the lower numbers, 28 and 18%, are measured against a criteria scale. But in terms of, yes, I have felt depressed, over half of us said yes. And then in terms of our ranking, if you will, among professions, our profession ranks 5th in incidence of suicide compared to others. And there are some things that can contribute to that. Our perfectionism, where if we do feel suicidal, we're going to look for methods that are going to, that we are more sure are going to actually cause our death. Next, I want to talk a little bit about some of the contributing factors that go into our risk for being suicidal in our profession. And I want to start out by turning this over to Faith to kind of talk about some of the things that were present, and she found out later to be present with her brother, Charlie.
Thanks, Joan. I'm a solo practitioner now. I actually officed in the same office that my brother Charlie had in downtown Minneapolis in the beautiful renovated Flower Exchange. I couldn't resist it when that office became open. So it was an office share with, a number of people, mainly coming and going, very busy, a lot of criminal defense lawyers. And that's what my brother did. He was a big time criminal defense lawyer, and he worked with folks that other people couldn't or didn't want to work with. So he worked alone, like many of us do. We're both extroverts. It's difficult to work alone. I want a social aspect. He did too. And really what happened over time is that he became more and more isolated. He was still, going to court. He still had clients. He would, chase down cases all over the state. So some days he would, sit and talk to my folks or I, and he'd say, gee, I've got to go up to St. Cloud and, meet with this person in jail. I've got a lead, or I'm going to Duluth. So he was busy, but he became increasingly unable to do things as time went by. And I didn't realize, my family didn't realize, and I think most of the people in his office didn't realize that his drinking was increasing over time. And he became very ill with this. When he passed, he was actually in the very late stages of alcoholism. But his brain did not connect his drinking to what was happening to him physically. And at some point that happens with many people. And it's not just like a denial, of either being mentally ill or being chemically dependent like he was, but he was past the point of being able to actually think that through. So he loved to be around people, as I mentioned. He lived for celebrating, the wins and going out with the other folks in his office and other people downtown Minneapolis. And oftentimes, of course, that involved drinking. He had a great group of friends, a lot of folks from St. Olaf who he was still in touch with. And he had several animals over time. And when he died, he had a big yellow lab named Sunshine, who we rescued from a divorce situation involving some other folks. And he would run her down at the river flats. He would get on his mountain bike, and he loved to be outside. He loved to meet up with people. But over time, he really felt, I'm looking at pressure to perform in the middle of the slide. He felt a greater and greater pressure to perform. And it's because when you're a criminal defense lawyer in particular, you're either swimming in it, where you're doing really well and you're on a roll with the number of clients and you're getting paid, or then you go, to the other flip side where you're broke and you're constantly looking for people. So he became more pessimistic over time. He didn't have the energy to go out and chase down people like he did, and to talk to people or even show up in the office. And he really felt that stigma, which I hate that word and I love that word. we talk about mental illness and mental health and the stigma. To say that you're suffering from a various condition, whether it's physical, emotional, or mental, is really difficult for us, where we have this, maladaptive perfectionism that Joan mentioned before, where we always have to be the better person, the more informed person, the person who's going to perform, for somebody else, especially when we're paid for it. And he didn't want to seek help. And he was afraid that other people would find out. This is still a big issue, by the way. If you talk to your colleagues and find out how many people are even willing to admit, or to an employer. I worked for a Fortune 250 employer for many years. Nobody wanted to say that they were depressed, for example. And now I can laugh about that and say, oh, that's nothing. That's treatable. But we have this, a lot of us have this idea in our heads, like we did growing up, that you don't admit that you have this particular kind of weakness.
Thanks, Faith. And I think because we do so much of our work in isolation, we become more isolated as we start to struggle and feel like we aren't measuring up. And if we start opening up to our feelings, it's like, well, you're not thinking like a lawyer. I can't show this. And so that becomes an even bigger strain on us. And, our job is to look for everything that could possibly go wrong, right? I mean, if you think about any legal matter that's brought to you, if you think about a law school exam, your job is to say, okay, what didn't go right here? Even if you're drafting a contract, you're anticipating every breach. And so we see the worst case scenario constantly. And while we could also make the decision to say, now I'm also going to look at what's the best thing that could happen, that's not how we're wired and trained in our profession. So that's another risk factor for us. As we've been through the last 3 years, Faith and I talked yesterday, and we'd had very different things the last time we presented this program, but we were looking at kind of where are we now? And these were some of the things that we identified as still being pretty important in putting us at risk. And, many of us are grieving. Many of us are grieving people we've lost over the past 3 years, or relationships that have changed, things like that. And when your grief is not resolving in what is considered a normal or healthy way, that can be a predictor for feeling suicidal. Society-wide, as I mentioned earlier, there is a greater use of alcohol, and people who had been in recovery found themselves really struggling. Other people in recovery found that they had good tools to cope. As our society is dealing with these kinds of stresses, those are expressed to their lawyers. And it's not just the pandemic, but it's also things like social change and racial justice initiatives that are a long time in coming, and that we should be spending time with. And there is the trauma that comes with that. And we also have things like the polarized society. And it doesn't matter what it is, whatever the issue is, our profession is on the front lines. And so we are constantly exposed to all of those additional difficulties. And we're experiencing the trauma that our clients are experiencing vicariously. So all of those things are there. Faith, did you want to comment on any of these?
Yeah, we had a good discussion about this yesterday, and things are changing. I think with courts reopening, in particular this last month, and people going back to work, I'm hearing more chatter, from colleagues about, oh, we got to be back in the office, or we got to deal with this. There are a lot of clients out there who also feel like their cases have been put on hold. They feel disenfranchised with the legal system, and so they might be, expressing that to you as their lawyers or to judges. So it's really kind of a, thinking of the right word, conflagration of many years of change that should have been coming, and we're all resistant to that. And so many people, will self-medicate like Charlie did. So if we're alone, or if we've been isolated, there's just such a greater chance for that to happen. And when you look at several years worth of it, it's really kind of, mind-bending that we've gone through this. And I will say for myself, I still haven't processed it. I think that this is one thing, with the pandemic, that we can only look back on probably in the rearview mirror and say, how was I different, before? What were the things that brought me joy, or that I didn't even think about doing? Like, oh, I got to go to work. I could show up downtown. Oh, there was a Caribou Coffee in the Skyway that I could go to that was open. I mean, we didn't think about these things because we took them for granted. And as a lot of these things that we took for granted were removed from us, I think it's become more difficult. I'm hoping that when people are able to get back to work, whether it's our clients or ourselves, that it will reduce our anxiety and give us a sense of purpose, and that hopefully we can integrate this, over time. But right now we're still kind of at that tipping point of not knowing, where we're going with it. I've thought over the years, what would my parents have to say about this? What would Charlie have to say about this? And I imagine, the outcome, knowing what happened 14 years ago, and the outcome after this, at least with my brother, is he would not have survived this.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Faith. We want to spend a little time on some data about what is happening in our profession and in society. And then we're also going to talk about what are some ways to recognize, and some myths and facts, and that sort of thing. So this is information on a survey of law student well-being. And these surveys were done in 2014 and 2021. And the change in the data was stunning. In 2014, 20% of the law students had thought seriously about suicide at some time. And in 2021, that was a third. So these are the students who had come into law school or were already in law school when the pandemic hit. In the 2014 survey, 6% of the students had thought seriously about suicide in the last 12 months. And in 2021, over 10%. So that's what's happening in our law schools, where that distress, am I going to have the right connections? Will I be able to have the career I want? Am I good enough? Those kinds of things are showing up that way. And I can tell you that the law schools are taking this very seriously. And there's some really excellent things going on, but this is the level of distress. The data we have about lawyers is from the 2016 study that I cited earlier, which is a collaboration between the American Bar Association Commission and Lawyer Assistance Programs and Hazelden Betty Ford. And when they asked the question, have you thought about suicide? Have you ever considered suicide? Just over 10% said yes. And then the follow-up question was, have you ever done anything that was harmful or dangerous, that without really thinking of the consequences? And then that was just about 3%, and then less than 1%, but still this is very significant, reported at least one attempt to die by suicide. And in a survey that was published in December of 2020 of judges, well, this is a small percentage, it's a significant number. 2%, when asked the question, have you considered suicide, said yes. So that's what's happening in our profession. And there are some theories about why people might be more likely to be suicidal. And so we have these three different theories. One is the getting away from one's perceived imperfection. There's the escape theory. The hopelessness theory is where there's nothing I can do, there's nothing anybody can do, there's no other way. And then interpersonal is I just don't belong, I don't have a place here. And so Faith, I'd like you to talk about how these resonate with you.
Well, when we look at that first column from the escape theory, I mean, this is really obvious to me, especially now. Charlie felt like he could not do the same things that he used to do. As I mentioned, he was having trouble actually driving himself from the near south side of Minneapolis, just beyond Lake Street, downtown, and parking, and getting himself into the building and getting to court. Part of it was because he had an infection in his leg that became very serious, and it was a flesh-eating bacteria infection, actually. And we think that he picked this up when he went to Palua for the 2000 year celebration with like 24 of his best friends, right? And so he was out on the beach for a couple of weeks. This is what he loved to do. And he came home and he thought, okay, this is like chiggers that we used to get when we were kids, up at the lake. But that happened, like I said, about 2000. He died in early 2008. He was walking on a cane. He was unable to get out of his front steps and to shovel and get the ice off. And we all know from several weeks ago exactly how bad that was. And it was kind of the same during that winter where it built up. So he really felt like he couldn't do the same things that he used to do. He blamed himself. And I think what he did was he turned it inside rather than looking outside for help. When I look at perfectionism, that's me. My brother was not a perfectionist. He was exacting in what he did. But he held a different standard where he was more people-oriented. I think, when we talk about why people would have like ideation, for example, and what contributes to suicide and our depression, it's really that loss of hope. I had a friend pop up last week, I told Joan yesterday, who's not a lawyer, who just said, how do you know, when you feel like it's time to quit? And I said, and she said, what was it like with your brother? And I said, really, I think he gave up hope. He didn't have any idea that he would be able to get well physically. He also didn't think that he'd be able to recover, his business. And in fact, he had mentioned to me, starting in, I think it was July, the year before we lost him. So 7 months before we lost him, he started calling me. And he hadn't done this for a long, long time. And he was telling me what was happening with him and with the business physically, but he didn't tell me emotionally so much. And what he said was, Faith, I really think that I want to quit this business of being a lawyer. I want to do something else, but I'm afraid if I do that, Dad will kill me. I mean, how ironic is that? And I said, what do you want to do? I'll help you. If you want to switch profession, if you want to, shut down, if you want to transition, I will help you. I will support you. But he had this ingrained hopelessness. And I think he felt like, well, if I'm not a lawyer and helping people, I'm nothing. So he translated his work, into who he was as a person. That's who he was, very caring person. So he didn't, we look at this last column, he felt like he didn't belong anywhere all of a sudden, just because he was disillusioned. He was totally isolated. He was lonely. One big clue with him was that his mail was piling up in our office. And so we had a big long couch in there and, a bunch of bookshelves cobbled together and a great executive desk. And the desk, interestingly enough, when I recovered his office, had all kinds of plans for doing another movie. He'd been a movie producer, which I don't know if I told Joan or anybody, but he produced a movie called Like Hell, which Of course, like, how could you have that name? My parents said, how could you name it that? Well, it was a docudramedy. Anyway, he had plans for something else, and he had notebooks there, and he had Hello Kitty items, believe it or not, from a good friend of his. But his couch was piled with mail. And the people in his office who ran it said, we can help get this to you. You know, either can you come in, when can you come in, or we can run it by your house. And he kept saying no, because he didn't want people to see that he was really sick. And it was such a great effort to be in there. This perceived burdensomeness, I really think that maybe he thought, if I quit, I'm going to be a burden to my elderly parents. And I don't know about the self-esteem. I would just say, of course, it took a nosedive. But let's just say that he wasn't who he had been for so many years, and he did not know how to recover from that. And I think a lot of people who lose hope have all that, you know, the rest of those feelings that can go along with it.
Thanks, Faith. You know, this particular diagram is one where when you think about someone you might be concerned about and you look at what are some of the things that are being exhibited, that you can kind of see where this might fit, because sometimes we have impressions about, oh, well, people who are suicidal are this, and yet it comes from many different places. And so these are some of those examples. So let's move on into kind of understanding where this can come from. We'll start out with just a little bit of real basics on mental health. And we're not talking about mental illness, we're talking about mental health. And that's where you've got to balance your connections, how you're feeling, how that's exhibiting, other things that are going on in your life in terms of having work satisfaction and things outside of work and being able to take care of your body. We so need social connections. And of course, that has been at risk the last 3 years. It's better, and yet we still have things that we have to be concerned about. And so we've lost those touchstones, those reality checks. And we've always felt a range of emotions, but if we don't have a reality check, if we don't have someone we trust, or if we don't trust ourselves, the more extreme ones can be out of control. And so when we cope effectively, we can live life on life's terms. A challenge comes to us, we figure it out, we look at the options, and we deal with it. And sometimes we don't necessarily like what our options are, and yet we deal with it. We're problem solvers. We look at a situation and say, okay, what are the options here? What are the arguments I can make on behalf of my client? We can make that, you know, the emotion side and the analytical side of our brain, they connect, and there's cross communication there where our emotions help us to understand the things that we have to think about. And we have ways to manage stress when it occurs, because it will in this profession. But sometimes our battery gets really low. And so some things to watch for are, do you have physical symptoms? If you didn't used to have high blood pressure and now you do, something's going on. What are you going to do about that other than medication? Sometimes we can have signs of anxiety, such as a rapid heartbeat and fatigue and things like that. We may change our behavior around things that are important to us. We may not eat well. We may not eat enough. We may eat too much. We may find ourselves in a state of dysthymia, which isn't depression, but it's on the way there, where we're kind of always just looking at the dark side. There's also a concept called languishing, which has been written about in these times where we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel with COVID. But what that light does is it shows us all the detritus inside the tunnel. And so we just have trouble focusing and getting things done. We may not be sleeping well, or we may be sleeping a lot. And of course, this can be affected by depression, and this may be depression. We're more anxious. We may overreact to things that wouldn't have caused that reaction in us at another time. And we wonder why we're here. We have that feeling of what is my purpose? And so as a result, we may have that languishing feeling, or it may move into depression, where we lose interest in things that were previously pleasurable to us. And we avoid people. We find it difficult to deal with people or annoying. And so the question to ask, are the symptoms that you are experiencing, whether it's the way you're feeling, the way you're looking at the world, the way you're acting, are they interfering with whether you can, in a way you want to, work, play, and love? And then how often, how deep, and how long? Because we can all have a blue mood. We can all have a bad day. But if it's something that is more than it used to be, if it's something that is more frequent, you compare how am I today or how am I this week with how I was a month ago, how I was 3 months ago. And if you really think about it, it's kind of like that parable where if you take a pot of water and it's pleasantly warm and you throw a frog into it, the frog will swim around until it gets too hot and it dies. Whereas if the water is already hot and you throw the frog in, it will jump out immediately. And so if your water has gradually gotten hotter and hotter, you may not realize that you are about to boil. Faith, do you want to comment on any of these things?
Yeah, I think that this is a really easy framework to either ask yourself or somebody who you care about, just in a general way before you get to the actual, suicide questions. But you might want to, think about introducing it with saying, I've noticed that, you are, say, less engaged or not present or haven't showed up or whatever it is. And I think that we're able to ask people, has what's been going on with you interfered with your ability to work, play, or love? That's an easy thing. In discussions with people who, if they've started, new psychiatric meds, for example, or they've had depression, or maybe they have winter depression. I know I haven't had it this winter, but last winter I had it, and I hadn't had it for many, many years. So all of a sudden it came as a surprise. And I thought, well, duh, you're not getting outside, you're not getting sunshine, you're not doing the normal things, you're taking your vitamin D, but you still feel, disengaged, or this dysthenia, as Joan mentioned, from the pandemic. So it's really, I think that this is key, because if we don't recognize what's happening within us internally, we can't do anything to take steps to fix it. And I guarantee you that, other people, your colleagues, judges, your children, clients, will notice these things about you. And you will probably notice these things about them more than, oh, they just don't seem the same anymore. This is kind of a discussion opener. As I mentioned, Charlie was sick with a very, serious physical condition that had become untreatable. But he also had another disease that told him that he didn't have a disease. So he didn't connect the dots up. He took some of the steps to try and, look into that and deal with it. But either I don't know if he was at the point where he felt like this isn't going to work, or it's not helpful, or I just can't make the effort. But I think that mentally he really could not connect up what was happening. And sometimes you will run into that with people where they have that suspended disbelief about themselves and how they're acting, and then what's going on inside of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Faith. And I think this phrase, are the physical, emotional, and behavioral symptoms interfering? All right. So we showed a group of symptoms, but it doesn't have to be those. Whatever is happening where I'm not able to do what I would like to do, I'm having trouble doing what I would like to do, then something's going on. And what is the help that might be available? That's where good professional help is really critical. And we have on the slide here, and these will be provided, some assessment tools, some screening tools. Those are certainly available, but they're a start. there's something to kind of help you to say, okay, I'm not imagining things. I really, if you hurt something where it hurts physically, you might want to look it up and say, what happens when I can't lift my shoulder? And, maybe it'll say 3 things, but you're still going to go see a doctor. And that's the same thing with mental health, is being able to be okay with working with a professional, because there's ways through this, no matter what is going on. So if we have symptoms and we're not dealing with them, well, then we can have things happen like depression. And depression is the #1 predictor for suicide. It's not the only one, but it is one. And not everybody who is suicidal is depressed. Faith, I think you have a comment on that.
Yes, I have some statistics. I should have checked to make sure if they're updated or not from the American Association of Suicidology. And it's these statistics, well, not the stats, but the actual risk factors for suicide are included in the handouts that Joan put together. So this is dating back to 2018. When Charlie died by suicide, he was 44. He was my little brother. Everybody thought he was my older brother. He aged faster than he should have. And he was actually in the least likely group of people to die by suicide in that age group. What happened is that it's kind of flipped, and the pandemic has changed some more statistics. But men will make up almost 78% of people who die by suicide versus 22% of women. And now what's happened is that his age category, which would have been 25 to 44, in 2018, that was the second highest. Now, and then it flipped to people being between 45 to 64 being the highest category. Everybody thinks that this is more of an issue with younger people. And what's happened with the pandemic is it's brought up the numbers for younger people, but it's still in the 21 to 30 age group. So when we look at, who dies and the statistic of 80%, of men dying, it's because men tend to use more lethal means. And so they have less attempts. A man may have 3 attempts, for example, for every, I think it's 11 or 12 by women, because they use less lethal means. So one thing I want you to take away from this, which I don't think it's written in here, but I always try and say it, is that the decision to die by suicide, to actually complete an act, is typically an impulsive act. And there's been some brain chemistry research from the American Association for Suicide Prevention and AFSP, they're out of New York. And they say that your brain can change its mind basically and overcome that particular urge within 30 seconds. That is how impulsive this is, 30 seconds. So if you're in a position to help somebody, and if you've got a minute, you can basically help keep somebody alive. It's, I'm losing my train of thought here a little bit, but the issue that we're really in is to recognize what happens before somebody gets to that 30 seconds, and to get a referral or to step in and find out, hey, do you have a therapist? We'll get into that in a little bit. But if you're able to do that, then you're not going to be a statistic like me being a survivor. I don't like to think of myself that way, but there's some 2019 research out there that showed that up to 40 to 50% of the population have been exposed over their lifetime to suicide. And for survivors of suicide, we are 1 in 61. So this loss is much more common than you might think in particular. And that's why it's important that you're here today, that you're learning more about this, and that you may be able to spot the signs and the symptoms, in people, and to get them to the right folks. But unfortunately, they don't always get to the right people right away. We are the ones who are in the middle. And I think that we have a duty to help people.
Thanks, Faith. And I just want to say how, grateful I am that you are willing to be vulnerable and share that this experience that I know is much more common than we think, as you said. One thing I want to say, which I think is critically important, is that any one of us may not recognize that something is going on, because the person who is depressed is going to try to not be impacted by other people giving them things to do. And so it's like, I'm fine, will be that defense mechanism. With addiction, the brain says you don't have a problem because it wants to protect the relationship with the chemical or the behavior or whatever it is. And sometimes it doesn't matter what you do, the person would have died anyway. And if you try and they die anyway, it is not your fault. It is never your fault. People die by suicide in psychiatric wards of hospitals. And you know how well they should be cared for there. And so we can reach out and we can make an effort, but it is not our fault, because the person who is in that place where it seems like the only reasonable option, they may have hidden it very well, or there may be nothing that anybody can do, but sometimes there is. And so when we look at whether somebody is likely to be suicidal, these are some things to think about. And this is a mnemonic. Is the path warm? So in other words, you remember when you were a kid, it's like you're playing hide and go seek, and it's like you're hotter, you're colder. Okay, well, this is you're hotter. You're more at risk. And so it's even thinking about it. It pops into your mind and you start to say, let me think about that. And then a lot of the other things we've talked about in terms of increased anxiety, wondering if you have a place, feeling like there's no way out, and then starting to act where you might engage in things that are more reckless and not care about the consequence. And then toward the end, sometimes the mood will get better because you think you have found an answer. And sometimes that mood will get better because of medications. And that medication makes you feel just good enough to carry out the suicidal act that you were not able to carry out because of the depression that immobilized you or some other kind of thing. And so I am almost a survivor of someone whose mood changed for the better, but we were able to intervene and we saw that person get the help they needed. And yet this is still so important on the road. So I've kind of given a few touchstones here. Faith, do you want to talk a little bit about this from your perspective?
Yeah. One of the chat questions was, can we talk more about, what the factors are, in recognizing this in people? I mentioned that Charlie started calling me, a few months before he died. And I don't know, it was like he was checking in with me. And I look back in it in retrospect, and he gave me all the information that I needed to be able to put everything together. But I was missing critical parts, like actually physically seeing him or relying on his particular description about what was happening, which focused really on, the anxiety, feeling trapped in the profession, not knowing what he was going to do. And I'll say that, in the last couple of months, I didn't talk to him for the last 6 weeks before he died. None of my family did, because he basically withdrew from us. And it was horrible. It was over Christmas. The last time we saw him was on Thanksgiving, and he'd been hospitalized for 3 days down at HCMC and trying to figure out what was going on. And, he'd had IVs, he had his vitamin B, he'd had all this, stuff done, and he was feeling physically better. So he showed up for Thanksgiving dinner, which we had at Champs, across the street from where my folks lived. And he let me order for him. I mean, he never let me do that. And he wanted something healthy. And he promised my folks that, he was going to get better. But he looked at my dad and he said that, I'm trying to remember exactly what he said. was going to still be here when he was 45. I mean, he was 44. He said something that kind of tipped me off to the fact that he might not be there anymore, which kind of was, I think, a reckless statement. But he had already made up his mind about what he was going to do, and we were still 6 weeks out. I think he'd made up his mind actually when he started calling me. And I don't know if there were, any attempts. I do know that, at the end, he was just angry with everybody. He lashed out at them. The mood change was just phenomenal. I mean, the reason that we even knew that he died was because he had been talking to some of his St. Olaf friends, and he didn't return a couple phone calls. And one of them thought, okay, we haven't seen or heard from him now in like a day and a half. And so they did a welfare check. And that's when they found him in his house with his great big yellow lab and his 2 cats that were in there. And I got the phone call in the middle of the night from the coroner's office. I just thought one of my parents had died, but no, it was him. So getting back to is the path warm? He had all the classic symptoms where he just didn't want people to discover what was happening from him. And he felt every bit of these things. And, his substance use was a bottle. The interesting thing was he was not depressed. So when you find out that people aren't depressed, you think, well, they can't be suicidal. And that was one of the first questions that the coroner actually asked me was your brother depressed? I said, no. Not that we know of. And then the question was he in therapy? Had he talked to a counselor at all? And I said, no. And I think he would have told me that. And then the next question was he on any medication for depression or any other issue? And I said, no, not that we know of. And in fact, none of these things were true. I've since learned that up to 30% of people who choose to die by suicide are not considered depressed. But that's only one category of mental illness. There are many others. And this was probably something that was driven more by substance use disorder.
Thanks, Faith. There are additional risk factors. We're not going to go into these, but just being aware that these are the kinds of things that can be additional predictors. And that stigma about having mental health treatment, that I'm somehow a weak person because I need that kind of help, is one of the biggest ones. So we're going to touch briefly on a protocol that's called QPR, question, persuade, refer. You've heard of CPR. Well, this is QPR. And this is something, again, where I would encourage people to look at this and do a deeper dive into it, because you can learn much more. It's not counseling or treatment, but rather it's a brief intervention and a way to offer continuing hope. And so what we want to start with is, and we've talked about a lot of these, recognizing some of the myths. And we start with the idea that, it's going to be inevitable. And what I think I said earlier was that it doesn't, sometimes it is, but often it isn't. And that you're not going to put the ideas in somebody's head, and that everybody has a chance to do something. People who are suicidal, it's not that they want to die, it's that they want a release from what is happening to them. And while there's that 30 seconds, somebody may have spent a long time, like at least 6 weeks, like Faith mentioned, in planning and thinking about it. And sometimes people will telegraph their intentions, but other times they will be extremely secretive and go out of their way to do things that will stop people from sensing. I talked with one person who said that, who was a survivor themselves. They said, I didn't go to church the Sunday before I was going to take my life because I didn't want anybody to see that I might be distressed and try and do something about it. So Faith, do you have anything you'd like to say about these myths and facts that resonate with you?
I think, I explained what happened with my brother. I really think that he'd been thinking about this for 6 months before. There were factors that were unknown to me, and to everybody else at the time, that contributed to this. And one of them I didn't mention was that, and this was just before the mortgage crisis hit, He had gotten behind, not on his main mortgage, but on a second mortgage. So a lot of the mail that was coming to him at his house anyway, they were bills, because all of a sudden it started accelerating with a bunch of fees. He was also getting collections notices from people who were, involved in cases or services, like a Yellow Pages ad at his office. So things were piling up. This idea, that people keep plans to themselves, they may communicate, but they may communicate pretty obtusely. Also, this myth about talking about it, if they don't do it, not true at all. This is a very secretive thing. He didn't want people to know. One thing that really complicated, his death for me for several days and for my family is that there was no suicide note, I was told. So not everybody does that. He actually had started writing one, and then he picked it up and then he left it. And when I went to his house, the day I found out that he died, very cold day in January, 18 below, 20 below, dark, early, right? And this friend of his from college actually walked right to the spot in his very crowded, hoarded, dirty, complicated house and walked right to the note and found it. And unfortunately, that suicide note went away. I had a chance to read it and to memorize it. But when we had a police officer show up at the house and disable what we thought might have been a loaded firearm, he actually took it away because he said, this is evidence. So this idea, that once you say that you're gonna do it, most people really just want an out. They want to be told it's okay, or somehow you can recover. And like I talked about the 30 seconds before, this is the most preventable kind of death. Anything that you do and say can stop somebody from making that decision. I know that with Charlie, and I've said this in every presentation that we've done, he had actually made up his mind sometime before, and there was nothing that anybody could have said or done to stop this. If it hadn't been that day, it would have been a different day. It could have been the day after he got out of the hospital. I don't know. But it's also really important to reiterate that even if you do have a client, a friend, a colleague, somebody who dies by suicide, if you've acted or if you've not acted, this is not your fault. I had to say that to my parents right away. Preface his death with saying, Mom and Dad, I have something really important to tell you. Yeah, why do I have my pastor on one side of me, and why do I have a former neighbor who's a surgeon and an RN on the other side of me? To help them to process this and to say, this is not your fault that this happened.
Thanks, Faith. And as we move forward, I want to talk a little bit about some of the warning signs and some of the things you might say and do. But take those signs seriously. And in hindsight, we see all kinds of things in lots of situations where if we'd seen it, we might have done something. So sometimes somebody might say something very direct. I wish I were dead. Other times it might be something like, I wonder if I'll live to be 45. And it's something about how, I don't have to deal with this anymore. You don't have to deal with this. And so some of the signs behaviorally is, well, first of all, if someone has a previous attempt, and sometimes someone who has had a previous attempt realizes how far they went and how close they came, and they're never suicidal again, especially with appropriate intervention. But a prior attempt where they did not die, they may feel like a failure. And in our profession, that perfectionism predicts that. We've talked about mental illnesses, giving away work, turning down work, that sort of thing, change in faith practices, that anger that we don't know where that came from. Within a situation, what has happened to the person? Has it been something that is a big setback? And so for Charlie, it might have been I'm going to be an economic failure, and the fear of being a burden. So how do we talk to people? Well, don't wait. Do it right away, and try to find a place to have it be private so that there is, so someone feels comfortable, and give yourself time. If they say, yeah, I need help, where would you send them? Know what that's going to be. So think about how would you ask somebody if you were concerned about them? And so these are approaches that aren't very direct. It's sort of more like, how are you doing?
Mhm.
And you can do that. Or you can be more direct and you can say, I've seen some things that really concern me, and I just have to ask, are you thinking about suicide? The question that I have asked a few times, including with a very close relative, is, do you feel safe? And then we go forward on that because they aren't safe from themselves. Don't say things like, well, you wouldn't do something stupid like suicide, would you? Because then that makes it about you. So rather, it's direct and it's without anything that has those qualifiers. And so if someone is willing to say, you know, I have really been struggling, listen, that's the first thing to do. And it's not your job to fix it, but rather to say, I want to help you get through this. Or can I help you find some help? And we have this thing called, will you promise me not to kill yourself until you found some help? That's a suicide contract. And I have that in here because it's something that sometimes people will do, but at the same time, then they have another thing to fail at. And so rather, what is generally recommended is that instead you say, well, what can we do to help keep you safe tonight or over the weekend? Or what's your safety plan? And so you do it as something that is for them rather than failing you. Now, if someone is in a therapy relationship, that's a whole different thing. This is more a matter of how you would connect with someone. And then you find a place for somebody to go. People think there's nothing that can be done. Well, there is. And the pieces that are falling off to the sides, that's just stuff. And yet they think that it's something that is absolutely hopeless. And so it may be that the emergency room is the next step. And if it doesn't, if that's not a possibility, then look at how can you find additional help? Who can they talk to? Do they have a therapist? Can they call their office? That sort of thing. And plan for those options. So most efforts will be greeted with, I don't have to go there. That'll be what comes in, that'll be what happens inside. And so get involved and take the lead. Say it's, I want you to live. I want you to be here. I want to be with you. I want to do those kinds of things. Who else can get involved? And of course, if it's an attorney-client relationship, that's a whole nother issue. We're going to touch on that very briefly. But LCL can be a resource even for what would be the, who would I call or what might I find? Sometimes there's groups that are working to increase awareness of suicide. And then check in with the person. The person who in my life who is closest to me, who actually tried to die by suicide. I believe that a letter they got from a mentor earlier in their life was one of the critical turning points in feeling like they were worth living. I reached out to that person and I said, if you feel like you could write something, this is what's going on. And the letter was about the difference that the person who was in the hospital had made to the mentor. And I think that was a turning point in their survival. The seeds of hope will help. And so be direct, listen to them, show your concern, and let them know you care. Don't promise secrecy because that makes it very difficult. Don't minimize, or your own beliefs. You wouldn't do that kind of thing. And there's these action steps. I know we're at time. We're going to go over a little bit. I'm sorry about that, but I think this is important. And if you have to leave, I believe this will be on demand so you can watch. Faith, do you want to comment on the QPR steps at all?
Yes, I do. I think
Good.
that, and I've lost my place what I've got for the paper. I think that your comment, Joan, about knowing that somebody cares is really, really important. I got a text this morning from a colleague just saying that she was thinking about me today. She didn't mention this presentation, and I saw her in person last week, but I didn't get to talk to her. But she knew because she was following, social media. And that made all the difference. One thing you can do is text. Another thing I didn't mention before that's really important in our profession is that my brother had cases that were scheduled to go to trial shortly before he died. In fact, he had a third-degree crim sex conduct case that was scheduled for trial in Ramsey County. And the judge had been calling him. He had another one in a first degree. I think it was in Dakota County. And so we had some people breathing down his neck. I really wish, looking back on that instead of, he felt kind of persecuted and felt like, what can I do? I have these judges breathing down my neck. In fact, he mentioned it to our family because he made them out to be the bad person. They're actually the good people. They had recognized that something was wrong. I really wish that, if you're in a position to say, hey, can we talk in chambers? Or can we schedule a phone call? Or if you know somebody even better, can we have lunch? Like, can I have a little bit of your time? And then you are going to, be able to figure out maybe what's going on, or at least check in, but make that person feel like they're valued and that they're still part of our culture. So it didn't get through to my brother. It was more of the paranoia at the end, I think, that did him in. But people did try. I think there needs to be more of this. And many of us are, avoidant on making phone calls. There's been a lot of research that shows that, in-person contact is actually better for our mental health when we can be with somebody face to face, unlike Zoom, unlike text, and that it boosts our serotonin and our endorphins, and it makes people feel better. So please, think about reaching out to somebody and asking the question if you have concerns.
Thanks, Faith. I'm going to do just a little bit of talk about well-being, but before I do that, I want to mention in terms of ethics, it's Rule 1.14, clients with diminished capacity. And these slides will be provided. And if your client is suicidal, they have diminished capacity. It's as simple as that. And Lawyers Concern for Lawyers is available for lawyers, judges, law students, and other legal professionals, as well as your families. So if you're attending this program but don't need the CLE, but you work in a law office, we can help you too. And it's any issue that causes stress or distress. And that includes up to 4 free counseling sessions. So if you have an EAP through your employer, you can stack the benefit and get more counseling sessions. And we can also coach you if you're concerned about a client. And our contact information will be in the slide. Is on this slide. And then I also want to make sure you're aware of 988, which is a number that you can text if you are looking for some help around suicide prevention. I want to finish the presentation part by looking at these kinds of things. How do we stay well? And we're dealing with a lot of other people's trauma in this profession. So thinking about the things you need in order to do basic maintenance on your body, and connections, movement, sleep, eat, letting go of things that aren't so critical, and recognizing what they are and finding ways to find true enjoyment. If this seems overwhelming to you, then call us. LCL is here to help you. And we're a resource for the entire profession. Our services are free, they're confidential, and there's someone to talk to 24 hours a day at our hotline. So Faith, I'm going to give you the last word. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It is so important to bring this information to our profession, and we consider you all allies now in the efforts that we're making. I do see one comment in the chat that we don't have time to answer, but help@mnlcl.org comes directly to me, and I'd be happy to answer the question about ex parte communication. Faith, would you like to take us out?
Yeah, thank you, Joan, for this opportunity. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it took me a long time to get ready for this. people who were close to me knew what had happened to my brother, and well, they thought they knew what had happened, but they didn't really know what had happened. And I decided that this was too important a topic to stay silent on. Suicide is permanent. Joan mentioned that before. I mean, I can't bring my brother back. And I've said before, and I'll say today, I'm not sure if he would really want to be here today with things that are going on. Some would be exciting, some would not. Do I wish that I could go back in time and change things? Yeah, I think that we all wish that. You do not want to be this person, you know, who felt like they were helpless to do anything to stop it. And I realized that this is not my fault. I mean, I'm trained in actually recognizing suicide issues. I volunteered with my church, work with people who are mentally ill, and somehow, you know, his best laid plans still escaped me because I didn't put 2 and 2 together in real time. You don't want to be that person. And we all have a responsibility to each other, you know, and to the profession to stop this as much as we can from happening. And I'm glad that you have some more knowledge and tools now. And Joan, thank you for being brave and sharing your personal situation too, which has evolved over, you know, doing these CLEs for 4 years now. Thank you for the privilege of doing this.
Right. Thanks, everybody. Go out and make a difference.